In the first half of our conversation, the focus was very much on Christian relations. And I know that you've all engaged with and written about Christian Marxist dialogue. So perhaps we could give that some consideration, because that was a very crucial element of the Christian experience of the Cold War. And for instance, Charles, I know that this relates very much to your time in Berlin, and I know that you've written extensively about your encounter with Marxism as being a vital part of your approach to Christianity.
Well, first of all, I deepened my faith and I gained a broader perspective on Christian Marxist relations through my experience in East Germany. There were well, let me quote, and let me make an exhibit. The Christian in East Germany. My wife and I translated Johannes Hammel's writings, and in that is an essay which kind of plowed things up in Germany. God's beloved East Zone. And to what he meant for it by that, let me quote him. Let me say it clearly to start with. It is a precious thing to preach here in the East that Jesus Christ alone, Lord and Savior, refreshes the weary and the suffering, that he has found the lost and strayed, and that no one can tear them from his hand or take from them the peace which the Almighty Father gives. What could be better for a man or woman? What could be more necessary or healthy than to be present where this message goes forth, to hear it, to believe it, and to obey it and bear witness to it? That was his affirmation of Christian presence in communist society. There were problems, and he gave examples in here, and some of them I thought I experienced myself. First of all, freedom. A Christian has freedom from a whole lot of things. A pastor once asked a member of the church, "Why do you go to church?" He said, "First, I am with friends. I am part of a community. And second, I hear a free word spoken, and it makes me free." The freedom of the gospel was the central reality. Another example, and this one Hjelm does, about a girl student who was a member of the Christian student group, and she was told that unless she joined the Free German Youth, which was the communist outfit, that she could not graduate and she could not pursue her profession. So she joined it and confessed to the pastor that she was trying to juggle these things. And finally, she she decided she couldn't do it. She couldn't be these two persons in that situation. So she went to the communist authorities and the Free German Youth authorities and told them she was leaving. And they said, "What? You're within weeks of examinations. What are you going to do?" And she said, "Because I was afraid for myself, I joined you. Now that I am free from myself, I'm leaving." The interesting thing that happened was that the communist officials were so impressed that they said to her, "Can't you decide to be a Marxist after all and join us? We need people like you." So freedom. The second question was a question of truth. I remember hearing a pastor say that his parishioner had said, his son, the son of the parishioner, had said to him, "I lie every day in school. If I didn't, you'd go to jail." And so this double-tongued relationship, which the children grow up with because they're confronted with one thing in school and another thing at home. The question of truth. How do you identify truth? That was one of the great struggles of it. And the third thing was the question of justice, of course. How do you, somebody has been unjustly accused or condemned for boycott hetze, incitement to boycott of democratic institutions. That was sort of the general. How do you stand up for when injustice is being done, and how do you protect the people who? Finally, the question of what is responsible vocation, Christian vocation, in a Marxist or in a collectivist society. People were facing that all the time. Here was a farmer whose farm was being collectivized. Here was a manufacturer whose factory was being collectivized. Here was a small shopkeeper who had to belong to an association which determined what he could sell and when he could sell it. How do you exercise Christian responsibility in a collectivist society where you don't make the decisions? This question was also, but also a central issue for them. Not to mention, did I mention freedom from fear? Freedom from fear of the spies who might report on you. Freedom from fear of the police who might turn you over to the Russians and you might end up in Siberia. All these fears were. And also the fear which makes you idealize the West and want to escape to it. The number of times I experienced East Germans saying to me, "How long do we have to hold out? How long do we have to wait before you come and rescue us?" Dressing me as an American. Yeah, not as a Christian. All these were there, but in the context of freedom which enables conversation. Because as long as the officials think they can manipulate you, dominate you, you can't have a free conversation with them. So that was and so that was what drove me to write a dissertation on recent theological encounters with communism. Mm-hmm. And I had Brunner, anti-communist, it's just all totalitarianism. Hromadka, who accepted communism and worked within it. Paul Tillich with his religious socialism, which just didn't get anywhere with the communists. Reinhold Niebuhr, who was in his early years, he was interested in revolution, and Karl Barth. And the reason for Karl Barth was, and the largest section of the book was, the reason for Karl Barth was that East Germans would say to me, pastors would say to me, what besides the Bible helped them? They said Martin Luther and Karl Barth. And incidentally, Karl Barth was a Reformed. Luther was Lutheran. I understand. But they were not concentrating on the whole, on the difference between Lutheran and Reformed. They thought of themselves as being one church confronting communism, inspired by Martin Luther and Karl Barth.
I think one of the things that's important about the period that you're there, which is the early 1950s, the experience that you relate in particular about saying to you, when is the West coming to free us and the Americans coming to free us? Remember, this is when you've got the Eisenhower-Dulles presidential campaign against Truman. And their rhetoric is very much that Truman was soft on communism and had allowed Eastern Europeans to be enslaved. And I know from looking at Foreign Office documents that there was concern in Britain that the rhetoric coming out of America would encourage East Europeans to believe the West had an interest in liberating them, which of course it didn't. This was rhetoric. So that would explain that sort of attitude that you encountered, and also mean that the authorities, which would also believe it, would be more rigorous, shall we say, in their levels of surveillance, because that whole thing about the Cold War, it's a long, long time, and it goes through different stages.
I remember going into the High Commission in Berlin, American High Commission, and a woman asked me, employee asked me, I said I was primarily there for contacts with East Germans. She said, why did they stay? Why don't they come out? And she couldn't understand how it could be a Christian in East Germany.
So it's this encounter with Marxism in East Germany that makes you more receptive to Christian Marxist dialogue. When does Christian Marxist dialogue first become a reality? When does it first emerge?
Well, Paul could speak with this.
Yeah. I think it's the late 40s, early 50s, but let me preface it with something else. What made the relationship between Christians and Marxists very difficult from the very outset is the very severe criticism on part of Marx and his followers of religion as a phenomenon. He basically precluded the possibility that people with religious convictions can contribute something to a new society, a new world order that he had envisioned, right? And so there were people in the 19th century who were sort of interested in Christian socialism, but that didn't go anywhere, particularly after the Bolshevik Revolution, because the Bolshevik Revolution went way beyond what Marx envisioned in terms of his critique of religion. They didn't want to only permit religion to die away, they wanted to bury it, right? And so it was a question of survival, and in the Soviet Union, from 1917 to about the end of World War II, it almost didn't survive. I mean, that oppression was, I think, perhaps the greatest persecution of Christians in all of Christian history. I don't think there's anything even in the early church that resembles what was happening in the Soviet Union. So needless to say, Christians were afraid of communism and were not looking forward to falling under communist influence. They were looking for liberating themselves from communist influence. But after World War II, we know what happened, namely the rest of Eastern Europe also fell into the Soviet orbit, right? So now here are these Christians who willy-nilly, without having really much of a chance, I mean, some people can run away, but you can't have emptying all of Eastern Europe of population, right? They might have wanted to run away if they could have, but they couldn't.
They tried it in East Germany,
right.
And that was the reason the wall was built.
Right. So then what happened is that Christians were now trying to see how can they accommodate themselves to the new situation. The vast majority of Christians were really not interested in Marxism as a philosophy. They thought it was alien, it was atheistic, there was nothing in it for them, and they just looked for ways of how to survive. And there were a number of avenues that they tried to survive. We're not going to go into that today. But slowly, some Christians started reading Marx, particularly when Marxists themselves started reading Marx beyond the kind of standard classics which were kind of approved through the lens of Leninism and Stalinism, right? As long as it was only Leninism and Stalinism, there wasn't really that much in there that would excite a Christian sort of philosophical or theologically. And then comes, in a sense, like late 40s, early 50s and so on, the discovery of early Marx by some of the Marxists. They're obviously immediately censured by the materialist branch of Marxism as being revisionist, which is the great sin. That's the heresy of Marxism. And they were being pushed to the side, except, interestingly enough, there was enough among those Marxists, enough intellectual vigor and courage, because it did take courage, by the way, to speak out, to start writing and so on. And then when Christians started seeing where these people are much more flexible, much more looking at the world, including at Christianity, not as the arch enemy of Marxism, but trying to somehow incorporate them into their own system, they start giving more positive appraisals of the role of Christianity. And then a series of theologians emerge also who likewise start looking mostly at these revisionist Marxists and finding something very exciting and very interesting. So what I've discovered in the book that I had written in the early 80s, Christian Marxist Dialogue in Eastern Europe, is that the dialogue really started in Poland first, without anybody outside of Poland finding out about it until the 1980s. Not that they kept it secret, they just never knew how to market it.
1960s.
No, 80s. When I was, well, 70s, really, the Polish dialogue escaped our radar.
Okay.
I had done a lot of research and never even heard that they had a dialogue there until I went to Poland and started discovering the material, which was almost at first entirely in Polish and hadn't really launched.
And they were, of course, Roman Catholics.
And they were Roman Catholics, right? So there was Adam Schaff, there was Kolakowski.
Yes.
These were the people who were starting to emerge onto the scene. But there was dialogue before Kolakowski and before Schaff that is still very little known, you know. All right, so it started there.
Can I just interrupt that, because this actually explains something that I remember reading about John Paul II, the Polish Pope, who usually is known for contributing to bringing down the communist regimes. But once you had rampant capitalism in Eastern Europe, and of course the damage it did and inflicted in Poland, one of the things he said is, well, people forget the good things about Marxism.
Yeah, right.
So he has that background as well, which...
Well, he experienced it, he lived it, you know. And the Polish situation was very unique. I think you can't make any parallels between how it was in Poland and how it was elsewhere.
That's true.
But we have really kind of two Eastern European countries and then a number of Western Europeans who are interested in the Christian Marxist dialogue. And the first, it was the Czechs. Particularly, we are thinking of Milan Machovec as the probably most brilliant proponent of a dialogue with Christians.
A Marxist philosopher who wrote A Marxist Looks at Jesus.
Jesus, right. Which
And
you had something to do with.
He was taught by and cultivated by Joseph Romanka.
Okay.
And the dialogue between Protestants and
in Czechoslovakia, it was predominantly Protestant.
probably started
right
in
Czechoslovakia. It was there. It was the members of the church, mostly the Church of the Czech Brethren,
Yes.
and a number of Marxists like Milan Machovec, Gardavsky. I forgot his first name. There were a number of these very, very bright, very vigorous thinkers who really attracted a wide readership. You know. Then in my former country of Yugoslavia, since Yugoslavia was a unique case, it had already departed from the Soviet bloc in 1948 and really wasn't part at all of what was going on between the main confrontation of East and West, trying to find its own separate road away from bloc politics, right? Mm-hmm. A group of Marxists also arose within Yugoslavia who were totally uninterested really what was happening in the Christian Marxist dialogue, either in Western Europe, the one that was like proposed by the Paulusgesellschaft out of Austria and Germany, and then the occasional French and Italian Marxists who were, they were not interested in that. They weren't interested in what was happening in Czechoslovakia. In the case in 1968, by the way, that dialogue was brought to a very abrupt halt in Czechoslovakia. Mm-hmm. And it ended. It was right around that time when the Yugoslavs started waking up and started really doing an internal dialogue, mostly between Catholic theologians and predominantly Slovenian and Croatian and some Bosnian Marxists. Very few Serbians were involved in that process. Mm. There was a group of so-called praxis philosophers. In any case, that dialogue was very lively until basically the collapse of Marxism, and then it ended. By now, as you probably know, there is hardly anybody in Eastern Europe who will admit that they were a Marxist.
That's right.
Even if they wrote as Marxists.
Yeah, so that's on. Right.
Today, you can't find any who will sort of admit to that, you know. There was another interesting series of dialogues which might be of some interest because it can help us transition to another important theme, and that is sort of peace working against the danger of a nuclear war, right? And that was started in Vienna, in Austria. I think it's mostly the work of one man, Father Rudolf Weiler, who was a Catholic social ethicist at the Theological School of University of Vienna, who founded a peace research center of his school. And there was also in Vienna another institute called the International Institute for Peace, which was a Soviet agency, clearly and unambiguously trying to promote peace from a perspective of the Soviet Union. And what Rudolf Weiler was able to do is to find a dialogue partner in the head of that institute, a man named Vladimir Bruskov, who himself was really just an apparatchik. He was a bureaucrat, but a bureaucrat with a soul who really understood, truly understood the dangers that the nuclear confrontation poses to human existence, right?
Yeah.
And so they start cooperating first just in Vienna, and then slowly they start pulling in others. And we had a series of these very interesting meetings. Some of them took place in the Soviet Union. 2 of them took place in the United States, one at my college, Rosemont College. We also had a meeting at York College in Pennsylvania. So we had these dialogues. These were strictly dialogues for peace. They were not at all theoretical dialogues. We didn't talk about Marxism as a thought system. We didn't talk about Christianity as a thought system. We predominantly talked about how to find ways of lowering the threshold of danger that was rising by the day, so to say. A fascinating thing about that is that the Soviet and the Eastern European delegation always came with an agenda. Their papers were prepared ahead of time. They were maybe not even written by them. They might have been written in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or whatever, And these papers almost immediately were a broadside at whatever the American policy at that particular time was. It was either neutron bomb, or it was the Pershing missiles, or whatever. And they ripped into us Christian theologians as if we were sort of responsible for what our country was doing, And then after some hours and days of conversation, we would start really talking to each other.
Yeah.
Rudolf Weiler had a brilliant idea, and that is that the major Christian Marxist dialogue doesn't take place officially at a session of the meeting, but sitting like the 3 of us do
Yes.
now here,
Yes.
getting to know each other as human beings with all of our issues, personal and social, and get to know each other in the spirit of Gemütlichkeit, relaxation, wine and cheese, and talking to each other, getting to know each other as human beings, starting to respect each other, and really, going back then to our own respective countries and trying to promote peace.
Let me ask, in Eastern Europe, or East Germany, where this dialogue was going on, what effect did it have really on the church's life?
It wasn't going on.
Wasn't exactly right.
In East Germany.
Right.
They were the most rigid because they were the most fearful, because there was constant pressure from the West. Right. I didn't mention the fact that which Christa Gringel developed in the Bratislava Conference, that the West German Church helped financially the East German Church for the whole 40 years of the of East Germany. They maintained the fact that they were one church, even die evangelische Kirche in Deutschland. I heard the slogan over and over again. Kirchengrenze, Staatsgrenze sind nicht Kirchengrenze. State boundaries are not church boundaries. Right. And so they kept so there was no
theoretical dialogue, but there was starting to be a kind of the church in socialism was a phrase that they had invented.
And socialism or Marxism with a human face.
With a human face. That came out of the Czech.
Well, this was a Christian formulation. Not a Marxist formulation.
They were not interested in it at all.
Christian, and this was also in ecumenical. I ran across it at the MIT conference on World Council conference on
Faith, science.
faith, science, and the future. They said an East German theologian said, Christian responsibility in an improvable socialism. Ein verbessertes Sozialismus.
That's what they were looking for.
That was what they were looking for, and that was the point at which they could needle and make suggestions to the Marxists.
Were there any links, direct links, between the Christian Marxist dialogue in Europe and what went on in Latin America, that led to liberation theology? Are there any links there?
It was later.
Well, some of the Latin American theologians studied in Europe.
Yeah.
And I think that's where they kind of got their ideas. Then they went back and they found a situation in Latin America of an oppressive social system, and they found some of the Marxist categories of critiquing that system very, very useful.
In the Protestant world, maybe the leading Latin American theologian was Jose Miguez Bonino in Argentina.
Right.
And he was heavily influenced and was in constant dialogue with Jürgen Moltmann.
Yes, he was, right.
As a matter of fact, I think they published a book together or something. I'm not sure about that. But there was that kind of connection.
Miguez was the only Latin American theologian that I know who has written Christians and Marxists and dealt directly with that interaction. But he was, and the theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, who originally projected liberation theology, he more or less accepted the fact that there was a class division, and he was hoping for the solidarity of the poor in their basic communities to transform the church. And so this was an economic concept, and that was the one in Latin America in those days.
The phrase "the preferential option for the poor," was
preferential option for the poor was also affirmed by the Pope.
Yes,
Right. But what made people fearful in the West is that there would be a social revolution in Latin America, which would then turn the balance of power, because at that time there was a certain parity, and there was a great fear that somehow socialism would keep on expanding and rolling, and if a bunch of these Catholic countries in Latin America were to become pro-socialist, as Nicaragua did at one point, as Cuba did earlier, right? That was the real fear that would then expand the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union on our own backyard.
The Vatican, of course, was concerned that liberation theology really was Marxist, and that was their condemnation of using Marxist categories or Marxist analysis of society.
But already in 1968, I remember that was the Prague Spring, and the third assembly, I believe, of the Christian Peace Conference, the third world representatives, Africa, India, Japan, and elsewhere, they were more, by the way, Rudi Dutschke, who was a German East German, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, I think so.
And
He led the student
they
rebellion.
were more revolutionary than the Soviets.
Absolutely.
And the Soviets were worried about them. They said, this is not rational, this is not progress, this is
It seemed like anarchy.
anarchy,
Yeah.
exactly, and which meant it was not under Soviet control.
Control, right.
So the Soviets wanted to control the Christians and the Marxists. What you were saying earlier, that they don't, that it's a certain brand of Marxism, the letter Marx.
Yeah.
Well,
The sort of humanistic Marxism, I guess.
yeah, they didn't necessarily quote Marx.
Well, they would, but they would find those parts that were liberating. I mean, there was much liberating influence, particularly, as we said, the early Marx.
Early Marx, yeah.
And so when this was discovered, the Soviets were really threatened by some of these interpretations of Marx himself.
Yeah.
And this is why they were so fearful. And that's why people like Machovets, as soon as the Soviets took over Prague, he was out of there. He was kicked out of the party, kicked out of his teaching position at the university and so on. These people suddenly became nobodies, so to say,
Yeah.
So the government came down powerfully on many of them had to flee to the West,
Yeah.
because they simply had no more space in that terrain.
Kolakowski, for example,
Yeah.
ended up in Britain,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and where Schaff ended up, I don't know.
I think he may have gone back, but I don't know. I don't know for sure, right? So,
You mentioned earlier, Paul, about the importance of nuclear weapons. And of course, when you think about the Cold War, the image is always the mushroom cloud. To what extent was that threat of nuclear annihilation of God's creation, if you will, a mobilizing force for more Christian activism?
perhaps.
Well, I think Paul has drawn a very helpful distinction when we were talking about Christian Marxist dialogue between sort of the theoretical Christian Marxist conversation and the peace movement, which was really, you pointed out, centered in Vienna, one of its manifestations.
One of those manifestations.
And was really, in effect, created by fear of nuclear warfare. That was the threat hanging over everything. This is a period of 45 years. We're still in it now, and maybe this week we're a little bit nervous about North Korea. But, that was the constant fear. The fear in the United States, the fear in the Soviet Union because we had the weapons, and the fear of every other place because they were in the middle. Which was sort of the geography of the Cold War. And it was created by nuclear power, nuclear armaments.
To what extent was there actually a dilemma in terms of, in the Soviet Union and the East European communist regimes, the peace movement, as you were saying earlier, is a legitimate movement that can be supported by the church leaders. In fact, it's almost expected that if you're a church leader, you're going to support the peace movement. But as you pointed out, you're going to take the Soviet line. What difficulties, though, does that create for Western Christians who obviously will have the same fears of nuclear conflict, not want nuclear conflict, but by the same token, if they join the peace movement, are going to be labelled as Soviet sympathizers or pro-communist? So what about this dilemma, and particularly for people like yourselves, who are already suspect because you're talking to these East European Christians?
Two things. First, the Soviets tried to conquer the word peace and define it in their terms.
Yeah.
And Hjelm, for example, his refusal to go and vote, they came to him and said, "Don't you want to vote for peace?" And he said, "What do you mean by peace?" and made them realize that it was the peace of the Soviet Union's dominance which made the difference. That's one point. The other point is that the pacifists' churches in this country, Quakers, Mennonites, Brethren, they started to participate in the Christian Peace Conference, but very naively. They're talking about peace. We're for peace.
Yeah. Not realizing that they can be manipulated.
Not realizing that their manipulation, that the concept of peace was manipulated.
Yeah.
And so gradually they withdrew.
Mm-hmm. If I may share an anecdote, something that did happen to me really while I was in Moscow. Okay, we arrived in Moscow and taking a little afternoon walk just to deal with the jet lag. And we run into this group of young kids on skateboards. And they were about like 13, 14 years old. And they saw we were foreigners by the way we were dressed and so on. And this one kid spoke fairly decent English. He walks up to me and said, are you from abroad? Yes, we are Americans. Oh, what are you doing here? Well, we've come to have some peace dialogues with the Soviet representatives. And he shoots back, they're lying. He said, they don't want peace. Now it turned out by the way, he was son of a policeman. 14 years. He said, they tell you about peace, but they teach us in school that we'll have a war with you and that we are going to win that war. So the citizens
What year would this be?
So that had to be somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
At the time when it wasn't sure at all what was going to happen in terms of the collapse of communism. Clearly a little more relaxed, but before Gorbachev, this was still Brezhnev's era for sure, And what was very interesting, and I discovered at that point that the people in Eastern Europe, the average person in Eastern Europe, had a much better way of distinguishing between the American government or the Western governments and the American people. They were told that Americans are bad, all of us. But they understood, no, American government is bad, American people are good. In our country, I think we never made that distinction on the whole. Soviets are bad, or we oftentimes use the word Russians. The Russians are bad, not just the Russian government. All the Russians are suspect and bad,
Yeah.
So we actually fell much more to the propaganda. We were more victimized, I think, by our much more effective propaganda. Their propaganda was so brutal and so simple-minded that a huge number of people didn't believe them at all. They had to spout certain slogans, but they didn't believe them.
Yeah.
No.
That's interesting because certainly I've heard similar stories. Yeah, the perception that we had, because that is what our propaganda told us, is that the Soviets are the masters of propaganda.
Uh-huh.
But in actual fact, it was the Americans and the West that were the real masters of propaganda, and that the people of Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And as you say, very sophisticated understanding. They came to be able to read between the lines to find out exactly what was going on.
They did, most of them, yeah.
The two newspapers in Moscow were Izvestia, which is information in English, and Pravda, which is truth. And the slogan, fairly well distributed among the people, was, there is no Pravda in Izvestia, there is no Izvestia in Pravda.
Yes, John Arnold mentioned that.
But that was from
them, it came from within.
From within the people.
Yeah, I would say that certainly in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, there was tremendous fear. I remember growing up in that atmosphere, tremendous fear of a nuclear war, an accidental nuclear war as well. This was something that really could happen. But there was another slogan that we had, which was better read than dead.
Dead, yeah.
But our perception again, or our fear, was that the American attitude was better dead,
Dead than read.
than read.
Yeah.
And of course, I don't think that was generally applicable. But certainly, as you mentioned earlier, there was a section of American Christianity for whom better dead than read was a reality,
Yes,
and whom again perhaps even welcomed the prospect of a nuclear war. Do you want to talk a bit about
Well,
that?
you know what? I mean, we had a very, very strong right wing. We still have a very strong right wing, and they were basically not just, well, they were anti-communist, but they were so anti-communist that indeed this particular slogan, "Better dead than read," I think they would have bought that. They would have accepted that as a way of relating to the other side. And the National Council of Churches was very severely being attacked by people on the right wing, some of whom were in these very churches that were members of the National Council of Churches. But they tried to attack the National Council of Churches by way of criticizing those of us who were in Korea, because they kind of considered us that we were duped by the Soviets into trying to keep the avenues open.
Yeah.
And so their line of reasoning was, well, you guys go to the meetings of the CPC. The CPC is an organ of the KGB. Therefore, you are working for the KGB. And ergo, since you have good relationships with the National Council of Churches, they too are being manipulated by Soviet foreign policy. The same attack, by the way, was made later on of the World Council of Churches.
Yes.
There were a number of even, I forgot the name of that Hungarian clergyman in...
Wurmbrand.
No, there was more recently. He had something to do with the Romanian turnover. He lived in
Oh, I
Romania.
know, Wurmbrand.
No.
No,
Later.
not Wurmbrand.
Wurmbrand was German Jewish, but I can't think of his name. He severely attacked the World Council of Churches for not speaking on behalf of the suffering Christians or the persecuted Christians. And I think at times we did make that mistake. It was hard to find that proper balance between being really interested in this unbelievably severe persecutions. And on a number of my trips to the Soviet Union, I did have contacts with the dissidents, and in fact smuggled out a whole bunch of samizdats, some of which we published and some of them I still have in my office.
You have to explain what samizdat is.
Samizdat means a self-published, basically typewritten document. Some of them were short, 2, 3, 4 pages, some of them almost book length, that were circulated as dissident literature in the Soviet Union at great threat for the persons who both printed it and who disseminated it. And also, actually, I took some severe risks when I was smuggling this stuff out, and somehow it seemed worth it.
But I think you've identified a really serious issue that is not fully solved by any means for the ecumenical organizations like the World Council of Churches, who are founded on organizations that are founded on the quest for unity. And their attempt to maintain unity across divisions like the Iron Curtain sometimes overrode the realities of suffering and martyrdom.
Yes.
And after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the World Council of Churches is still going through a very deep kind of process of self-examination, because it's been very much criticized for having turned its back on Christians in the East. But at the same time, it said, we're an official organization and we have to deal with other institutions.
And these were member churches.
And member churches are it's a really a complicated question that has not, I don't think, has been solved fully yet by any means.
But surely the activities that you were engaged in and the reaching out to Christians behind the Iron Curtain, that would have given some reassurance to the communist authorities about Christianity, because what the archival records are showing, what publications are coming out now are showing, is that there was, as you know, we've talked a lot about the way in which the Soviets used religion for propaganda purposes and so forth, but so was the West, and not just the Americans, and they were using them for subversive purposes.
Yes.
And you know, again, the archival record is very clear on this now, that the Soviets really feared a combination of Christians, Orthodox, Protestants, Catholics, of which they had, you know, large populations in Eastern Europe, against the regime. And this heightened that fear. And, you know, when you look at the persecution, and they're challenged on this persecution as religious persecution, their response is, no, it's political persecution. They're involved in anti-regime activities. Now, we know that certainly they all weren't, but we also know that that fear was valid.
Well, you know what? I mean, the word anti-regime was so broadly defined that if you just looked the wrong way, you were already anti-regime, you know? I mean, yes, and there were, we know that there were missionaries and evangelists and so on who were actually working for the CIA and had been going to Eastern Europe to smuggle Bibles and to do this and that. But there were also many of them that had no political agenda whatsoever, and yet they were deeply suspected, not only by the foreign travelers who went into Eastern European countries, but the local people. It was dangerous for many of the local pastors and local church people to be contacted sometimes by outside persons.
Two various things to say about the World Council of Churches. I was in it. We were sent as fraternal workers to Germany, to Berlin, for contact with East Germans as part from the World Council of Churches. And incidentally, we were also Presbyterians, and they sponsored us too, but we didn't label ourselves as Presbyterians. We labeled ourselves as ecumenical. And our East Germans friends and contacts regarded us as a symbol of what? A symbol of light. The Ecumenical was their friend. They could see us. That may have been our only real contribution. We were there, and we were, and therefore they clinged to the ecumenical movement as strengthened for the freedom of the church in their situation. Another change scenarios entirely. Nicodeme. Nicodeme was let me start. Before Nicodeme, the relations between the ecumenical movement, the National Council of Churches, the British Council of Churches, and the World Council of Churches, they spent the whole time in the 1950s talking to the Russian Orthodox Church primarily, also the Baptists and others, but with trying to discover the terms on which the churches in Eastern Europe could become members of the World Council of Churches, and there were frank dialogues. There were frank dialogues about religious freedom. There were frank dialogues about justice and freedom in general in this process. And finally, in 1961, the Eastern churches, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Georgian Orthodox Church and all the others, Armenian Orthodox Church and so on, did join the World Council of Churches. And then the whole situation became an internal dialogue, and not a dialogue with those outside. And it was still a dialogue. And in 1966, I remember being in the World Conference on Church and Society, where they went hard at it, Eastern and Western church representatives. Now, what Nicodemus was doing, he was using ecumenical relations, including us and the World Council of Churches and the Lutheran World Federation and all the rest of them. He was using us as a counter, as a bargaining point for the to the Soviet government, saying you better join, permit this and cultivate it, or let us cultivate it, in order that we can, in order to gain more influence in the West. That's what he said to them.
Yeah.
But what he was thinking of would gain more, was that it would gain more freedom for the churches in the Soviet
So
Union.
in a sense, they were using each other.
Yeah.
He was manipulating both,
Yeah.
but his aim was to, through ecumenical relations, to gain more freedom for the churches.
But you know what's very interesting? After the collapse of communism, the word ecumenism has become a very unpopular word in most of the Eastern European countries, because they understood, first of all, there was a kind of a coerced ecumenism within the country. In order to control the churches more effectively, they oftentimes forced church merger and some kind of an ecumenical council and so on, through which the government had a better oversight over what was happening within the churches. It's easier to control one central body than many individual churches, right?
Unity.
So after that system collapsed, a lot of people who were not in favor of that basically said, yeah, ecumenism is the means by which the interest of the Marxist government was being promoted. And therefore, we don't want to have anything to do with it. So you have, for instance, currently, even for instance, Serbian Orthodox Church, they have a number of bishops who said the greatest heresy of all time in Christian history is ecumenism.
Well,
And,
the Georgian Orthodox Church
Same,
withdrew.
they pulled out.
They pulled out of the
Several of
World
them.
Council.
Yeah,
The
the Georgian
Russians were a
Orthodox.
couple of times this close from pulling out.
And most of this, and that was the other thing that that Nicodemus was trying to combat, the congruence of the church with nationalism, and now in the post communist era, the Russian Orthodox Church has become much more nationalistic, and the Serbian Orthodox
Oh, absolutely.
Church.
Not just they. You know what? In practically all those national churches, it came back with a vengeance.
Yes.
Where actually the national designation of the church is more important than the religious designation of the church. It's a way of affirming one's own identity, and indeed the wars in the 1990s, as Yugoslavia fell apart, were oftentimes waged in the name of religion, even though they were not predominantly religious wars. They were really ethnic wars.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, one way of accentuating the ethnic differences is to put the religious label on you. You put a certain kind of a cross on your lapel, and then you go to fight for God and country.
One of the ideals of the ecumenical movement was supranationalism, transcend nationalism. So you have enforced ecumenism in the Soviet bloc and the East European so-called socialist regimes. So you can understand they want to turn against it, and that unleashes the nationalism. But what about in America? Because there seems to have been an affinity between Christianity and nationalism in the American context as well. And certainly in that post-Cold War period, there was a great deal of triumphalism in that sector of Christianity, which did look to indict again the ecumenical movement and what they called the brand name churches, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, and Methodists, etc., and so on. So is there a parallel?
And the Baptists and the Lutherans.
Yeah. I mean, you know what? The intertwining of American nationalism, which is not an ethnic nationalism, it's a different form of nationalism, and religiosity is a well-documented factor. Several people have written about the American civil religion and the way in which our nation co-opts its religious bodies, and the way in which our religious bodies feel very comfortable in this situation. You know, what is remarkable, and you don't find that in too many countries, is practically in every church at the front, there's an American flag and a denominational flag, you know. And we are very comfortable about that. If we had walked into a Russian Orthodox church and we saw the Soviet flag and their Orthodox flag, we would have been disturbed, right? I don't know, probably they do have the Russian flag now, and so if there is this merger, this comfort, we do think that we are God's chosen country. There, you know, this notion of American exceptionalism, that we are really different from everybody else, that we are the privileged people of God who are kind of trying to provide direction for all of humankind. We sort of feel pretty self-satisfied with our role as being sort of the cutting edge of...
That certainly came out strongly in the last election now.
Yeah.
But I think in America too, and this may be a little bit of a different discussion, but since the so-called end of the Cold War, the American churches are not prospering, and they're so preoccupied with simple survival that anything called ecumenism or the ecumenical movement is kaput.
Yeah, that's true.
The book that I just translated and was published in Swedish is entitled Ecumenism on the World's Terms. But the sales department at Erdman's Publishers said, we do not want the word ecumenical in the title of any book. That will not sell. So the book has a different title.
It's amazing.
We don't even, we're beginning to lose a sense as to what the ecumenical movement is all about. Yeah. And in terms of unity, justice, and peace. Bonhoeffer asked the question, which I think the churches continually have to ask the question. He asked the question, what use have we been? Very famously. And that's for me one of these questions that, you know, getting old, I look at my own life and say, what use have I been? The churches have to ask that kind of question too. At the beginning of the Cold War, the churches were so important that Truman tried to get the World Council of Churches to come to the United States and put its headquarters here. Truman sent the first ambassador from the United States to the Vatican. At the end of the Cold War, were the churches a big factor in political decisions, East and West or whatever? I'm not sure. And that somebody used the word this morning, instrumentalization of the churches. That might have been what was happening at the beginning of the Cold War. Right now, are we of any use, or are we relevant to anything?
I'll
It's a
tell
question.
you, my students do not think any longer that. There's a big, my students do not think that the churches are of any use any longer.
Yeah.
Huge change in comparing, let's say, students of 30 years ago,
And
where
most of
religion
your
still was very
Yeah.
important to them.
and most of your students are Catholic.
No, no longer. Really pretty, incredibly diverse. We've got Pentecostals and Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslims and Hindus and you name it, we've got, But some of them are still relating to their religious bodies, but a very large number. I've never seen anything like it. It's starting to resemble Europe, I think, more and more. Maybe we're catching up. I don't know.
We're breaking down more.
Yeah.
Well, one of the, speaking against the Cold War scholar, looking at archives and looking at publications, there is a suggestion from churchmen on either side, in the Eastern Bloc and obviously in the West, that they contributed to the end of the Cold War. Now, the jury is out on that. Certainly secular scholars feel it had a lot more to do with events within the Eastern Bloc than it did to do with outside pressures. But certainly the churchmen that I've spoken to do have a sense that the ecumenical movement created spaces for dialogue that meant people were talking to each other. That whilst they might not have been in any way responsible for ending the Cold War, that they at least contributed to the Cold War ending without becoming a nuclear conflagration or any shots being fired. And certainly in the last witness seminar, Werner Kratschel, who was in East Germany, as a churchman who made contacts with the Western churches and with the Eastern communist officials and Western officials, feels that the churches in the Soviet bloc played a mediating role that made sure nobody started fire on each other.
Our friend Risto Lehtinen, who really is, if anybody, I suppose, the grandfather of this fledgling project on the churches in the Cold War, he made a visit some years ago to the London School of Economics. And they have an institute, I guess, on Cold War studies or something like that.
They do, yes.
And he was simply told, and the quotation has stuck with me, that the study of the role of the churches during the Cold War is an unwritten chapter in the history of that period, the Cold War, that really needs to be done. And these were, not theologians or church historians or secular scholars. And at the London School of Economics, they said, but we nobody has yet done that piece. And it's important, so important that it needs to be done.
I think probably this is a good time, a good note on which to close. But I think what's important is to stress that, as you have very clearly demonstrated, it was a global phenomena, and that it needs global collaboration, and that the project Christian World Community in the Cold War is embarked on precisely that. That it's not a history that can be written in any one country. You'll only end up with a very distorted picture. You need all the historians, the theologians, the churchmen, the scholars, the activists, all coming together, which is precisely what this project is about, to bring people such as yourselves together with scholars so that history can be written.
And we want to thank you for bringing us together, because if it weren't for you, I don't think we would have actually
No,
met today.
No.
You know, it was your
That's
prodding,
That's
your
right.
invitation.
that's really true,
So
Diane.
we thank you a lot for kind of being that facilitator, both for that conversation, but also for the very fact that we are meeting here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.